COMEX is heading into a delivery month with silver hovering near $64, and the numbers don't line up. The deliverable pile is smaller than the paper promises piled on top of it. If even a minority stops rolling contracts and demands metal, who gets paid, and who gets exposed? Let's define the battlefield first, because the silver market only makes sense when you separate two completely different worlds that are pretending to be the same thing. On one side you have physical silver, bars, coins, industrial-grade material in vaults, metal that can be weighed, assayed, and shipped. On the other side you have paper silver, futures contracts, swaps, unallocated accounts, ETF shares, synthetic exposure, and the endless ocean of promises that trade as if they were the real metal. COMEX sits right at the center of that collision. COMEX is not just a price chart. It is a futures exchange where contracts can, in theory, be settled by physical delivery. And that, in theory, is the entire story of what is happening right now as we move into a delivery month with silver hovering around the $60 to $65 range, repeatedly tagging the $64 handle, and volatility screaming that something underneath the surface is not stable. A delivery month on COMEX is the moment when the paper game is supposed to touch reality. It's when contract holders who are long can stop rolling, stop cashing out, and instead say, no. I want the metal. Most of the time, the system survives because most traders never intend to take delivery. They trade futures like chips in a casino. They close, roll, or cash settle. That's how the paper market stays bigger than the physical market, because the exchange depends on the assumption that the majority will never ask for the one thing that exposes the fraud, delivery. But in late 2025, that assumption is being challenged from multiple angles at once: industrial shortages, export restrictions, rising lease rates, backwardation flashes, and a physical market that keeps whispering the same message: there isn't enough readily available silver at the paper price. Now here's the problem we have to name clearly, because this is where the red alert starts. COMEX reports multiple categories of inventory in its approved vault system. The most important category for delivery is registered. Registered inventory is the metal that is supposedly available, warrant-ready, and deliverable against futures contracts. Eligible metal may exist in the vault, but it is not registered for delivery until the owner chooses to make it so. In a stress event, that distinction becomes life or death for the exchange, because eligible can stay eligible, and nobody can force a private holder to volunteer their metal into registered at the exact moment the crowd demands it. So when we talk about whether COMEX can deliver, we do not mean total metal that exists somewhere in a building. We mean registered, the pool that is actually on the table for delivery right now. At the same time, you have open interest. Open interest is the number of outstanding futures contracts that haven't been closed. Each standard COMEX silver contract represents 5,000 ounces. Multiply contracts by 5,000 and you get the paper ounces currently sitting on the board as live claims. And this is where the situation turns ugly. Because when you look at registered inventory versus paper claims, you get a ratio that tells you how tight the system really is. Not emotionally. Mathematically. Right now, the ratio people need to understand is the one you can't unsee once you see it. Paper claims are running at roughly 2.4 times registered inventory. In other words, for every 1 ounce of deliverable silver in registered, there are about 2.4 ounces of paper promises that could demand that same ounce. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is basic structure. This is how leverage works in futures markets, until the day it doesn't. And the timing matters, because delivery months are not abstract. They are deadlines. They are the points on the calendar where the exchange either performs, or it improvises. So let's put that ratio into plain language. Imagine a warehouse with 40 million ounces of registered silver, metal that is supposedly ready to be delivered. Now imagine the open contracts represent roughly 96 million ounces of potential claims. You don't need every contract holder to demand delivery for the system to get uncomfortable. You only need a minority that is large enough to overwhelm the registered pool. If even a meaningful fraction of longs decide that cash settlement is not acceptable, if they decide they want bars, not dollars, the exchange and the clearing members face a problem that can't be solved with liquidity. Because liquidity is a paper concept. Metal is a physical one. This is where people get fooled by headlines. They hear, silver is $64, and assume $64 is the real price. But the real question is, $64 for what? $64 for a promise? Or $64 for deliverable metal, in size, on time, with no delay, no substitution, no, will make you whole, language? Because in a delivery month, the entire paper market's credibility rests on one simple capability: deliver the commodity the contract claims to represent. And when paper claims float at 2.4x of registered, the system is effectively admitting something in advance. It is designed to function only if most participants behave like traders, not like owners. That's why the phrase, stand for delivery, matters so much. Standing for delivery is the moment a paper holder stops playing the game the way the system wants and instead plays it the way the contract technically allows. And here's where the paper versus physical conflict becomes more than a slogan. It becomes a trap. Because paper markets can survive volatility. They can survive price spikes. They can survive margin hikes. What paper markets cannot survive is a legitimacy crisis, when a large enough group decides the paper is not good enough and forces conversion into the underlying asset. That is why exchanges and bullion banks obsess over orderly markets. Orderly means predictable behavior. Orderly means cash settlement. Orderly means rolling contracts. Orderly means nobody checks whether the silver is actually there in the quantities implied by the paper. But late 2025 is not orderly. Late 2025 is a world of supply chain stress, strategic mineral politics, and industrial users who do not care about COMEX narratives, they care about receiving metal. So what happens if they can't deliver? That question is the entire nightmare scenario for a futures exchange that has grown used to the idea that delivery is optional in practice, even if it is possible in theory. If the system reaches a point where delivering metal at scale becomes impossible or dangerously destabilizing, there are only a few ways this story can go, and none of them are clean. One path is cash settlement pressure, dressed up in polite language. The exchange doesn't have to announce, "We are out of silver," to effectively treat the contract like a cash product. It can happen through incentives, delays, or alternative delivery mechanisms. In plain terms, they pay you to go away. They offer a premium in dollars to avoid handing over bars. And for some participants, that works, because they never wanted metal anyway. Another path is rule changes. This is where the trust breaks. The exchange can raise margins, change delivery terms, tighten position limits, add emergency measures, or introduce procedures that make it harder and more expensive to demand delivery. The official explanation is always risk management. The real function is always the same: reduce the number of people who can afford to call the bluff. Another path is force majeure language, the ultimate escape hatch. Not always announced as force majeure, but functionally the same. Due to extraordinary market conditions, obligations may be satisfied by cash equivalent. That is the moment the paper contract stops being what it claimed to be. And understand what that would mean psychologically and financially. It would mean the paper price is no longer the price of silver. It becomes the price of a settlement system. A confidence token. A number that can be managed because it is detached from metal. Meanwhile, the physical market would do what physical markets always do when paper breaks: it reprices upward through premiums, delays, and scarcity bids. The price you pay to actually get silver in hand becomes a different universe than the price you see on a screen. This is why the ratio matters so much. A 2.4x paper to registered structure is not just high leverage. It is a vulnerability. It is the system telling you, in numbers, that it cannot tolerate a delivery-minded crowd. And you can already see the behavioral shift creeping in: more talk about delivery. More focus on vault categories. More attention to lease rates and short-term borrowing costs. More scrutiny of who is sitting on metal and who is sitting on promises. When that cultural shift accelerates, the exchange doesn't just face a lot of volume. It faces a question of credibility. Because if COMEX can't deliver at a moment when the world is screaming for real metal, then the market has to confront a brutal truth. For years, price discovery has been dominated by paper instruments that were never built to function like true ownership. That is the core problem definition for this video, and it's the reason I'm calling the delivery month a red alert. Not because silver is volatile. Not because $64 is a scary number. But because the structure, registered inventory versus open paper claims, creates a fragile system that depends on compliance. And compliance is exactly what breaks when fear turns into urgency and urgency turns into action. If you're holding paper exposure, the critical question is not, will silver go up? The critical question is, what exactly do I own when delivery pressure hits, and the exit doors narrow? Because when a system is built on the assumption that most people won't ask for the thing they were promised, the moment they finally do ask, that's when the real price of silver is revealed.